When the Germans attacked Poland on September 1st, 1939, my parents, and of course everyone in Poland knew that it was not going to be good for Poland. They had high hopes that the Polish army might repel the Germans. The story often was told that the Poles had wonderful cavalry on horses, good-looking uniforms, but the Germans had airplanes and tanks, so they didn't stand a chance. Around the 3rd or 4th of September, the Polish government said that journalists and other people should try to leave Warsaw, should try to leave Poland. And my mother told my father, you have to leave. My parents at that time had a 3-year-old daughter. My older sister Sarah is 3 years old. And my father said to her, I can't leave you. And she said, you have to leave. He had been a member of an anti-Hitler organization, and she knew that if the Germans came in, he would be among the first to be arrested, not so much because he was a Jew, but because he had written against the Germans. And they went back and forth, no, 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 yes, yes, yes. And she finally convinced him that he had to leave. And he did, with some other journalists. So he was able to make his way to that Russian-occupied zone. At this point, Poland still had not surrendered, had not been overrun, and also through various ways managed to get to Vilna in Lithuania. And Vilna and its surrounding area for a time were independent. They were not under Russian sovereignty or occupation. His message to my mother had been that before he left, if Poland is able to repel the Germans, I will come back. If not, I will want you to find a way to get to me. So my mother is left in Warsaw with my 3-year-old sister. And again, the next 6 weeks are a very long, complicated story. But one of the things my father had done before he left is he took a small photograph of my sister and a small photograph of my mother with him. After the Germans had completely occupied Poland, Warsaw was under Nazi occupation, my father managed to get a message through someone to my mother. And what he had done is he had a photograph of himself taken with a picture of my mother and my sister on a table, so she would know that this actually came from him. And on the reverse side of this, the message was, try to get out of Poland. You come to me, manage to get out of Poland, and the addresses of places that she could get to in Białystok or in Vilna. And having gotten this, my mother knew it was time that she had to leave. My parents eventually got one of these forged visas, partly from the Dutch consul and partly from Sugihara. And they managed to leave Lithuania in the early part of 1941. They went to Moscow, had permission to stay in Moscow for 4 days. From Moscow, they took the Trans-Siberian Railroad to Vladivostok on the far eastern end of Russia. Of course, it's my mother, my father, and my sister Sarah. From Vladivostok, they went to Shanghai, stayed a short time in Shanghai, and then took another boat to Kobe, Japan. And in Kobe, they were waiting for permission to go somewhere else. Some friends had gotten visas to go to Canada, Australia. They never ended up with a visa. In the summer of 1941, the Japanese government said that all Westerners are going to have to leave Japan. Of course, we know in retrospect that Japan was planning the attack on Pearl Harbor and didn't want foreigners there. So they had no choice but to return to Shanghai. There was no visa needed to go to Shanghai. It was at that point considered an international city. Even though Japan occupied a large section of China already, Shanghai was still considered this independent settlement. And so they went back to Shanghai. At that point, there were probably about 20 to 23,000 Jews in Shanghai. After Pearl Harbor, Japan occupied all of Shanghai, and they were under Japanese occupation for the rest of the war. The Japanese did not really distinguish between Jews and other Westerners. The only difference came, and I think it was in 1943, there was an edict that all refugees, they did not say Jewish, but all refugees who arrived after 1937 would have to live in a restricted area. Of course, the Jews called it a ghetto. It was known as Hongqiu. And if you go to Shanghai today, you still see remnants of this area, and in the last few years, because of the number of tourists that have come, there are plaques in that area showing where the Jewish ghetto was, and in a nearby park there is actually a plaque by the people of Israel thanking the Chinese for their generosity during the war, because the Chinese really were very generous to the Jews who lived there. The ghetto was not just Jewish. The Chinese people lived there too, but it was a very poor area, very crowded. You had to have a pass to get out of this ghetto. But it was possible to get the pass, and my sister went to school outside of the ghetto. And of course, in comparison to what was happening in the ghettos of Europe, as my parents always said, they were together, they were alive, my sister went to school, and they managed. So after the war, it took my parents another 2.5 years to be able to get a visa to leave Shanghai. You had to be sponsored by a family. You couldn't just the Jewish organizations couldn't just say, we will take care of them. And the Jewish organizations in New York went to wealthy Jews and in America and said, you have to help us sponsor these people. And we eventually received a sponsorship by a family named Klein, who owned chocolate businesses in Manhattan called Barton's Chocolates. And they sponsored us, and we came to the United States. When we arrived on April 20th to the United States, now again, you have to remember, this is a story that has been told to me. I spoke mostly Yiddish at that point. I was 2.5 years old. My sister spoke English and Yiddish because the school she went to, the Shanghai Jewish School in Shanghai, was run as a British school. And my parents spoke English, my father fluently, my mother some English. But I spoke mostly Yiddish. And we arrived in San Francisco, and all our worldly possessions were in 2 large wooden crates that my father had nailed shut when we left Shanghai. And we were on the pier waiting for immigration. And we were somewhere in the line, and as the line was progressing and the immigration officer was coming to see everyone's papers, my father saw that he was making everybody open up their suitcases. And my father was very concerned because he had nailed the 2 wooden crates shut. He had no hammer. He had nothing that he could pry these crates open with. And he had said to my mother, I don't know what I'm going to do. I can't open them. And at that point, I was 2.5 years old. I stood up on one of the crates. And as the official came over towards us, I started singing the one English song that my sister had taught me on the boat. And I started singing in English, God Bless America. And the story in my family is that the official is looking at me, and everybody around us was very, very quiet, and he is looking at me and waits till I finish the song, takes my parents' papers, stamps them, and says, "Welcome to America."